Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 101st deck and it's titled Party Purraj, so I hope everyone is ready to party today. But if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So first up, before we get into the actual deck tech, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel, or some ways that you can follow us if you're interested in getting some updates. So first up, we have our Twitter account at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, and email dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. If you ever have any questions, or you're looking for updates, or you just want to talk, maybe suggest some cards, these are all great ways to do it. I try to check these as much as I can, so I will do my best to get back to you as quickly as I can, and those are all great ways to reach out. If you're looking to support the channel, you can, of course, always head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link, which is in the description of this video. And the most direct way that you can support us is actually on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Over there, you'll get access to things like the deck techs a week early, or at least the deck lists a week early, maybe not a full deck tech, just kind of a shortened description of them. You'll get access to a Discord channel where we actually make all of the decks and brew up some of the decks and also record the games for them. You'll get access to, honestly, a great community of people in that Discord as well. You'll get access to the unedited gameplay videos. You'll get access to a random card sent to you every single month. And then, of course, I know I get a lot of suggestions for these videos. People want to see their favorite cards, or maybe cards they think are bad. I am more than happy to take suggestions, and I will get to as many of them as possible. But the only way I can guarantee that I get to your suggestion is if you are one of our patrons. I will get to all of their suggestions with no exception. It might take me a while, but I will get to them. So, of course, I gotta shout out our 5 current patrons. We've got Doodle, we have Eric Huey, Calvin Schmidt, William Swiftfoot, and, of course, our newest patron, Jeff Winger. So to the 5 of you, thank you all so much. And I suppose with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our actual deck. So starting off, we got to talk about our random card of the week. And speaking of our suggested cards from our patrons, we have one here from Doodle, who suggested his over on Discord because he was getting that access from Patreon. And that card is Purraj of Urborg. So Purraj of Urborg is 3 black for a 2/3. It says Summon Legend, but she's now a cat warrior. And she has first strike when she's attacking, and we can pay a black, put a +1/+1 counter on Purraj of Urborg, use this ability only when a black spell is successfully cast, and only once for each spell. So it is noticeable that it does just say whenever a black spell is cast. It does not have to be cast from us. It could be anybody. It's most likely going to be us because we can build around that a bit more. So she doesn't have great stats, right? A 5 mana 2/3 that only has first strike when she's attacking is not ideal. It is nice that we can kind of pump her up over time. And obviously, since this is our random card of the week and she is a legendary creature, it only makes sense that she is also going to be our commander for this deck. And originally when I started building this deck, I had no idea what the heck I was doing. I didn't know if I wanted to do some sort of devotion deck. I didn't know if I wanted to do some sort of attacking deck or a +1/+1 counter deck. And eventually, I came to the realization that Purraj is a warrior when I looked at her actual card on Scryfall rather than just the Summon Legend. And so I started to look at warriors, and the train that led me down is that we put in a lot of cards that cared about warriors. We put in warriors in the deck, and we started to move into a warrior themed deck, but there wasn't a ton of that in mono black. So then I started to see that I had put in a bunch of party cards because we cared about warriors. So if we're putting in party cards, we might as well also include wizards, clerics, and rogues in an attempt to make this a full-on party deck. So that gives us a bit of a head into our themes, and that is, of course, our first theme, party. We want to make sure that we have clerics, rogues, warriors, and wizards, with the expectation that we always have a warrior in our command zone if we need it. So we do lean a little bit heavier into warrior synergies than some of the others, but that's just because we have a guaranteed warrior whenever we need her. And so a great example of the party mechanic is Borakos Party Leader, which is 3 and a black for a 2/4 legendary creature orc. Borakos Party Leader is also a cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard. And whenever Borakos attacks, defending player loses X life and you create X treasure tokens, where X is the number of creatures in your party. And he does also have choose a background. Because he's not our commander, we obviously will not choose a background. But this is where things get a little complicated, and I want to very quickly explain the party mechanic just in case there's any confusion. Because Borakos says we lose X life and make X treasures, where X is the number of creatures in our party, that number can only ever be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. We can never have more than 4, because if we have 2 clerics, it doesn't count both of them. It's only going to count 1 cleric. So while this is still very good, it could make an opponent lose 4 life and we make 4 treasures every time we attack, which is incredibly powerful. It is important to note that we can't go above 4. So there's no way to kind of trick the system and get a ton of life loss and a ton of treasures. We have to make do with what we've got. But this is a great example of what we're trying to do with party, because we need to try to make sure we always have those 4 types in play. And so moving into our next theme, we'll play into our party synergies a little bit. And in this case, we're going to use a lot of ramp, because a lot of party cards require us to have a ton of mana. They cost a lot of mana. Or we just need to make sure we have at least 4 creatures in play at any given time. We need to make sure we have the mana necessary to actually cast them. So that's where things like Black Market come in, which is 3 black for an enchantment. Whenever a creature dies, put a charge counter on Black Market. Then, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add 1 black mana for each charge counter on Black Market. Now, this is going to play doubly into what we're trying to do, because there's a good chance we're going to spend most of our time with this deck in combat. Our creatures are just naturally going to die. Hopefully, our opponents will be blocking our creatures, so their creatures will die. Black Market doesn't care whose creature dies. As long as any creature on the battlefield dies, we get a counter. So if we are constantly in combat, we're attacking, we might be blocking sometimes, things are going to be dying, we'll get a ton of mana from Black Market. And that's only going to help fuel our deck, let us put more creatures into play, let us attack more, put more counters on the market, and that can get out of hand very, very quickly. So that then leads us to our last theme. If we have a ton of party creatures, we have a ton of ramp, and we care about creatures dying and combat, we probably need to make sure that we have ways to get our creatures back from the graveyard. So some of the best ways we can do that is just straight up reanimation, taking our creatures from the graveyard and putting them right back onto the battlefield. And the nice thing about party is that we get a super sweet party card that does exactly that. So we get Thwart the Grave, which is 4 black for a sorcery. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. So if we have a full party of a cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard, we can cast this for just 2 black mana. Then we return target creature and up to 1 target cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Since the vast majority of our creatures fall under one of those 4 categories, it's very easy to cast this for 2 mana and just return 2 creatures from our graveyard to the battlefield. Because as long as we have anything in there that we want, we can get that with the first trigger, the return target creature card, and then we can kind of pick and choose what else we want, because again, most of our creatures are going to be clerics, rogues, warriors, and wizards. So Thwart the Grave is a phenomenal card in this deck. Even at 6 mana, it's not that bad. It does kind of stink that it's a sorcery, but we can make do with that because we can reduce the price on this and, of course, ramp into it with things like Black Market. But overall, that is going to be the goal of this deck. So we want to have a ton of party creatures, we want to make sure that we're ramping, and we want to protect our creatures, well, protect them in a very roundabout way by making sure that when they hit the graveyard, we can bring them back. That is our deck, and the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some key cards, some cards that really help the deck run and kind of synergize and help push us toward a victory. So first up, we're going to have Solemn Doom Guide, which every time I see this creature come down, it is an absolute powerhouse of a card. It is 5 mana, 3 black for a 4/5 Tiefling Cleric. It's got flying, and each creature card in your graveyard that's a cleric, rogue, warrior, and or wizard has unearth for 1 and a black. Now there are a lot of expensive clerics, rogues, warriors, and wizards, and when I say expensive I mean mana wise. We're talking like 6+ mana, so if we can basically put them onto the battlefield from the graveyard for only 2 mana, yeah, we would have to exile it at the beginning of the next end step, but it gets haste, it can attack right away, we can activate any abilities right away. It is incredibly powerful because we can, if we hit 6 mana, just get 3 creatures back out of nowhere, and our opponents might not have great defenses for it because a lot of our creatures fly or have menace, have some sort of evasion. So no matter what we're doing, Solemn Doomguide is going to be an absolute all-star because it gives us kind of a burst of potential combat activity. And that is going to be the first of our key cards. Of course, we're going to have a few more. Our next one's going to be a little bit different. That is going to be Mind Blade Render. Now, this is a personal favorite card of mine. I don't put it in as much as I probably should, but this is my cue to put it in more decks, and hopefully yours as well, because Mind Blade Render is 1 and a black for a 1/3 Azra Warrior. Whenever your opponents are dealt combat damage, if any of that damage was dealt by a warrior, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. This is incredibly important for a couple of reasons. One, Mind Blade Render is themselves a warrior, so if they deal damage to an opponent, we draw a card. Our commander is a warrior, so if she draws us a card, she'll be doing damage to our opponents. And then it doesn't say it has to be our creatures that do the damage. If our opponents are attacking each other and they have any warriors, we will still be drawing cards. And warrior is an incredibly common creature type, so it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for our opponents to just kind of incidentally have some warriors. So I do think Mind Blade Render is going to put in quite a bit of work in this deck, and it's going to be a little bit surprising how many cards it draws, especially if it comes down on turn 2. So a very powerful card that synergizes very well with what we're trying to do. And then finally, we have our last key card, which is going to be Varragoth Blood Sky Sire. Varragoth is 2 and a black for a 2/3 legendary creature, Demon Rogue. He has Death Touch and Boast, 1 and a black. Target player searches their library for a card, then shuffles their library and puts that card on top of it. Since we're going to be spending a lot of our time in combat, Boast is going to be an ability that we're going to trigger most of the time. And if we're talking about just attacking with something, a 2/3 Death Touch that then searches our deck for a card and puts it on top of our library is very, very strong, especially because it's a rogue, so it fits into our party mechanics, and we might be able to just play it from our graveyard with something like Solemn Doomguide. We could reanimate it with Thwart the Grave. There's plenty of ways to get this back, and as long as we can attack with it every single turn, we can choose exactly what we want to draw every single turn. And that can get out of hand very quickly because we can make sure we have exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. If we need a board wipe, we can go and find one. We need card draw, we can go and find it. If we need a specific creature, we can go and find it. So Varragoth puts in a lot more work than you would expect, considering it does just search your library and put the card on top rather than into your hand, but it means we can set up our draws. And we can set up our draws in a bit of a secret way because our opponents don't know what we get. We do not have to reveal the card that we search for. So those are our key cards. I think they're all very deserving of the key card slot. I think they're all very powerful cards. And I suppose, without any more conversation on our key cards, let's talk about some cool interactions in the deck. Some cards that synergize very well together, and honestly, in most cases, they're just cards that I kind of want to highlight and didn't have a good other place to do it. So our first cool interaction is going to be between Multiclass Baldric and Maskwood Nexus. So Multiclass Baldric, already going to be an all-star in this deck because it's 1 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature has lifelink if you control a cleric, Death Touch if you control a rogue, haste if you control a warrior, and flying if you control a wizard. Then, as long as you have a full party, prevent all damage that would be dealt to equipped creature, equip for 2. So already, if we just have Purraj, we can give her haste because she's a warrior, or anything else on the board. If we have any clerics, rogues, wizards, we can also get lifelink, death touch, and flying. And if we happen to have a full party, no matter what creature we put this on, they're not going to be dealt any damage. Not just combat damage, prevent all damage. That means they're surviving blasphemous acts. That means they're surviving any damage-based board wipes, any removal spells that use damage. That can be very powerful, and we can put it on something like Varragoth so that we can attack, make sure Varragoth won't die. He still has Death Touch, so he will still kill anything in combat, and we get to search our library for something. So just on its own, Multiclass Baldric is definitely a key card, and honestly also deserved a spot in the key cards, but I wanted to specifically mention how it interacts with Maskwood Nexus, because Maskwood Nexus is 4 mana for an artifact that says creatures you control are every creature type. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. Then you can pay 3, tap it, and make a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. So the reason this is going to be important is because if we have just one creature, we can equip Multiclass Baldric, and then with Maskwood Nexus, that one creature is every creature type. So we do in fact control a cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard. So the equipped creature will get lifelink, death touch, haste, and flying, even if it's the only creature on board. Now, notably, we do not have a full party. This is a very unique interaction because if a creature is all types, we can only choose for it to represent one of the 4 party types, so we would still need 4 creatures to get a full party, but with Maskwood Nexus, any 4 creatures gives us a full party. Even if they're 4 rogues, they're now 4 technically changelings, so they're every creature type, they can count as the rogue, cleric, warrior, and wizard. So these 2 cards combined are very, very powerful. Honestly, even on their own, they're still very powerful, and both probably could have been key cards, but I did want to highlight the interaction between the 2 because I think that they really just boost each other up in ways that you might not expect. But that is only the first of our cool interactions. Of course, we got to talk about our second cool interaction, which is where we see a bit of a treasure sub-theme. We haven't talked about that too much. Not every card in our deck makes treasures, but we talked about Barakos earlier, Grim Hireling here, Ruthless Technomancer, they both also make treasures. This is another way that we can ramp, so it's just kind of another part of the ramp package. But these 2 synergize very well together, especially because of the treasures. So Grim Hireling is 3 and a black for a 3/2 Tiefling Rogue. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create 2 treasure tokens. Then you can pay a black, sacrifice X treasures, and target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. So we're making a ton of treasures because we can make at least 2 every single time we go to combat, assuming we get through with any of our creatures. And then we can pay a black and sacrifice as many treasures as we want to give a creature -X/-X, essentially removing it from the board, because even if something has something like indestructible or maybe it gets regenerated, it's not going to matter too much because we could keep this train going. It doesn't say we can only do it once each turn, we can just only do it as a sorcery. So we can, use it once, maybe our opponents find some way to stop it, we can just do it again. But then the question is, where do all these treasures come from, and what else can we do with these treasures? And that is where Ruthless Technomancer comes in, which is 3 and a black for a 2/4 human wizard. Again, you'll notice both of these are a rogue or a wizard, so they still fit into our theme. And when Ruthless Technomancer enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature you control. If you do, create a number of treasure tokens equal to that creature's power. Then you can pay 3 and sacrifice X artifacts, return target creature card with power X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. X can't be 0. So we can either use our treasures to kill a creature or use our treasures to return our creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield, but either way, both of these creatures will be making us treasures. Ruthless Technomancer makes us sacrifice a creature, but we make a number of treasures equal to its power, and we have a ton of big creatures in here, so that wouldn't be out of the ordinary to make a ton of treasures. Or we can make a ton of treasures just by going to combat and doing what we want to do. Then we can kind of choose if we want to kill a creature or get something from the graveyard. So both of these synergize very well, give us a ton of options, and While Grim Hireling can only be activated as a sorcery, Ruthless Technomancer can be activated at any time. So that is super, super useful. And since we've got these two cards anyway, we might as well make use of their abilities. Plus, sometimes we just need the treasures to ramp. So those are all of our cool interactions for this week. And the last thing we've got to do, since of course we are working on a budget, is take a look at the actual budget of the deck. So this week, our price came out to $88.66, which is not super close to our budget limit. It's actually a little bit lower, about $12 below. And surprisingly, that is still the price, despite the fact that our most expensive card in the entire deck is $19.10, because I was able to put a Cabal Coffers into this deck, with the idea being that if we're ramping, we may as well use Cabal Coffers, because what else could we do in mono black besides play a ton of swamps? So Cabal Coffers, it's a land, it doesn't make mana on its own, which is a bit of a problem, but you can pay 2 mana and tap it to add a black for each swamp you control. So if you're looking to trim down the price of this deck, you could get it down to about $60 just by cutting this one card. And if that's not quite your style, this is just a land. So I did want to highlight our second most expensive card, which is not a land. And then if you wanted to cut that as well, you could, because our next most expensive card is still quite expensive because it's Cryptghast, which is $11.15. So if you wanted to keep Cabal Coffers, then you'd trim the price down to about $77. But if you actually wind up cutting both of them, they're both around $30 total. So that gets you down to about $58, which is a much more manageable rate if you're looking to trim down the price of this deck quite a bit. However, if you can keep Cryptghast in there, because Cryptghast is 3 and a black for a 2/2 spirit, has Extort, and whenever you tap a swamp for mana, you add a black to your mana pool, it's another ramp spell. Most of the mono black ramp cards are going to be a little bit expensive. That is unfortunately kind of the nature of the mono black cards, because they just add so much mana at any given time that they tend to be a little bit more expensive. But if you do need to cut them, there are some very cool rogues, warriors, clerics, and wizards that exist in Magic that I was not able to put into this deck that I would recommend swapping in. So that is just my recommendation. If you have them, they are great cards. If you need to trim the price, that's probably what you want to cut. But on the other hand, if you're looking to actually increase the price of this deck, I do have one card that I would recommend for an out-of-budget upgrade, and the card that I would recommend replacing. So first up, the card that I would recommend putting in is Kalitas, Trader of Get. The card that I would replace is Obsidian Battle Axe. So starting with Kalitas, Kalitas is 2 black for a 3/4 legendary creature vampire warrior. He's got lifelink, and if a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, instead exile that card and put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. Then you can also pay 3 and sacrifice another vampire or zombie and put 2 +1/+1 counters on Kalitas, Trader of Get. So obviously, the big draw here is that he's a vampire warrior. He fits into our party theme. He's also Graveyard Hate, which is incredibly important because it doesn't exile any creatures that would go to our graveyard, but it does exile creatures that would go to our opponent's graveyard. And every time it does that, we get a 2/2 zombie that he can then sacrifice to get 2 +1/+1 counters. So Kalitas is incredibly strong, which is why he's got that $15 price tag, plus the fact that he sees play in formats like Pioneer. So if you're going to put in Kalitas, my recommendation of a card to take out is actually Obsidian Battle Axe, which is a bit of a weird card. It's a 3 mana for a tribal artifact warrior equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+1 and has haste. Whenever a warrior creature comes into play, you may attach Obsidian Battle Axe to it, and it equips for 3. Now, normally this is a very good card, and I'm not going to say that it's not, because it does things like give Purraj haste and +2/+1, which is great. That's what we want to see. However, it kind of draws a little bit more hate than you might expect, because people know that you can just kind of free equip it to any warriors that come in. They know you have a warrior in the command zone. Something like Kalitas is a warrior. People are kind of unnecessarily afraid of this card, and I think it draws more hate than it needs to. because people are always trying to keep mana open in case you drop some massive warrior with haste. They want to make sure that they can answer it. So I would probably take it out just for that reason. However, if you are looking to get in a little bit more damage, it is still a very good card. So if you think there's another card in the deck that you should take out instead of Obsidian Battle Axe, please do let me know. I would love to hear what you all think of what card should come out to put in Kalitas. But that is the vast majority of our deck tech today, and the last thing we're going to have to do is take a look at how this deck actually performs in a game. So we are going to run this deck up against 3 separate opponents and find out just how good it really is. And this week, we are joined by McRae, who is playing Horde of Notions and has the companion of Gigantha the Wellspring. We have LK, who is playing Rada Drobic of Urborg, and we have Eddie playing Tuvasa the Sunlit. So starting off with McRae and their Horde of Notions deck, this is, I would assume, an elemental deck. I don't know too much about it other than because Horde of Notions cares about elementals and playing them from the graveyard, we're most likely going to be against an elemental deck. And since we have Gigantha in the companion zone, there are no cards in this deck that have multiple colors of mana in their mana cost. So Gigantha, for example, wouldn't allow you to play something that is 1 white. You could only play something that would be like 2 and a white. So that means that there are some cards that are probably very good that can't be in here. But I'm very interested to see how this goes, and it's kind of cool that Gigantha is themselves an elemental elk. So very cool synergies. I'm very much looking forward to it, and McRae always has awesome decks, which, speaking of, if you're interested in anything that McRae is doing, I will put a link to everything that they do, most likely to their Twitter, because that is where they post most of their stuff. So if you're interested in what they're doing, check them out. Next up, we have LK playing Rada Drobic of Urborg. And I think without looking too heavily at the other two, this is probably the deck that I am the most concerned about. Rada Drobic is an absolutely insane value engine. It just keeps recurring value, getting creatures back out of the graveyard, and doing some crazy things with legendary creatures that you're technically not supposed to be able to do, which is why they're legendary. But being able to abuse the graveyard and the legendary, and by extension non-legendary tokens, Rada Drobic can do some really wild stuff. So I am very excited to see what LK can do, but I'm not going to lie, I am pretty afraid of it as well. And then finally, we have Eddie, who is playing his Tuvasa the Sunlit deck, and it is important to note that this game was actually recorded on Eddie's channel. He streamed it over on his Twitch, so I will link that in the description as well if you're interested in checking out the full game, or if you just want to support Eddie. He's an awesome guy, so go check all of his stuff out. But his Tuvasa deck is an enchantment deck, and I think other than Rada Drobic, this is probably the next deck that I am the most concerned about, because Enchantress is very, very powerful, and I say this as someone who personally has a Bant Enchantress deck, so I know just how strong they can really get. So I'm looking forward to see what he can do, but I am also pretty scared of it. So I think that today we have some very strong opponents. I'm very interested to see how the game goes. I hope you all enjoy it. If you do, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel so we can keep making some more of this content, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, McRae goes first, followed by myself, LK, and then Eddie. On McRae's first turn, they play a Misty Rainforest, sacrificing it to search their library for a Jetmire's Garden, putting it into play. I play a Swamp. LK plays a Plaza of Heroes and casts Soul Ring, followed up by casting Altar of Dementia, letting him sacrifice a creature to mill target player equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Eddie plays an Exotic Orchard. McRae plays a Primal Beyond, revealing Forgotten Ancient so that it comes into play untapped. Then they cast a 3 visits, searching their library for a forest and putting it into play tapped. On my turn, I play a Cabal Stronghold, and then cast Skeletal Changeling. LK plays a Swamp. Eddie plays a Forest. McRae plays a Scalding Tarn, sacrificing it to search their library for a Breeding Pool, paying 2 life so that it comes into play untapped. Then they cast Forgotten Ancient, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a player casts a spell, and also allows them to move those counters to a different creature in their upkeep. On my turn, I cast Inquisitorial Rosette, and then move to combat attacking LK for 1. LK plays a Plains and casts Lauren of the Third Path, destroying my Rosette when she enters, and also being able to tap to draw LK and target opponent a card. Eddie plays a Hallowed Fountain untapped, paying 2 life, and casts his commander Tuvasa the Sunlit, letting him draw a card whenever he casts his first enchantment each turn, and also giving her +X/+X, where X is the number of enchantments he controls. McRae casts Nature's Lore to search their library for a forest, putting it into play tapped. He also plays an Arid Mesa and sacrifices it to search their library for Ketria Triome, putting it into play. Unfortunately, on my turn, I still can't find a third land, so I simply pass. LK plays a Swamp and casts Bolus's Citadel, letting him play cards from the top of his library, spending life instead of mana to cast them. This lets him pay 4 life to cast Yawgmoth Thran Physician, which lets him pay a life and sacrifice a creature, putting a -1/-1 counter on a creature and drawing a card, and also lets him pay 2 mana to discard a card and proliferate. Then he pays 2 life to cast Lightning Greaves, immediately equipping them to Yawgmoth, giving him Shroud and Haste. After that, he moves to combat, attacking Eddie for 2 with Lauren. Finally, he taps Lauren to let himself and I draw a card. Then in the second main phase, he pays 3 life to cast Morbid Opportunist, drawing a card once a turn whenever a creature dies. Pays 3 life to cast Lurrus of the Dream Den, letting him cast a permanent with mana value 2 or less from his graveyard once a turn. And once Lurrus resolves, McRae casts Nameless Inversion to give it +3/-3, killing it, but in response, LK sacrifices Lurrus with Yawgmoth, paying a life, putting a -1/-1 counter on Forgotten Ancient, and drawing 2 cards. Eddie plays a Plains and casts Arasta of the Endless Web, drawing a card and letting him make a 1/2 Spider token with Reach whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery. McRae plays a Zagoth Triome, then casts Life of the Party, which gets +X/+O for each creature they control when it attacks. It also creates a token copy of itself for each opponent, giving them control of a token and then goading those tokens for the rest of the game. Then, he moves to combat, attacking LK for 9 with the Forgotten Ancient. On my turn, I play a Swamp and cast Varragoth Bloodsky Sire, letting me pay 2 mana when he attacks to search my library for a card and put it on the top of my deck. Then, since my Life of the Party is goaded, I attack LK with it, but since it only gets +2/+0, he easily blocks and kills it with Yawgmoth. On LK's turn, he casts his commander Rada Drabik of Urborg, which lets him make a token copy of any legendary that dies under his control, except it's a 2/2 zombie in addition to its other types, and also gives his zombies vigilance. He then pays 3 mana to cast Phyrexian Altar, letting him sacrifice a creature to make a mana of any color, activates Lauren to let himself and I each draw a card, plays a Plains, and then sacrifices the Life of the Party to make a white mana, letting him cast Elis Il-Kor, which gains him a life when a creature enters under his control, and makes each opponent lose a life when a creature dies under his control. He also sacrifices Lauren, making a token copy of her, drawing a card, gaining a life, making each opponent lose a life, and destroying Arasta. He also sacrifices Morbid Opportunist, making a white mana and making each opponent lose a life. Finally, he sacrifices Elis to make a black mana and make a token copy of it. This allows him to cast Teshar Ancestor's Apostle, letting him return a creature with mana value 3 or less from his graveyard to the battlefield whenever he casts a historic spell. This lets him sacrifice the token copy of Elis to lose a life, put a -1/-1 counter on McRae's Life of the Party, killing it, and also drawing LK a card. Then he pays 3 life to cast Yeheni Undying Partisan, which can sacrifice a creature to become indestructible, and also gets a +1/+1 counter when an opponent's creature dies. This triggers Teshar, returning Lurrus from the graveyard to the battlefield. Eddie casts Zeus's Many Journeys, letting him play an additional land this turn, then attacks me for 2 with Life of the Party. McRae moves straight to combat on their turn, attacking LK for 15, but he blocks with Lurrus, gaining 3 life, killing Lurrus, making a copy of it. Then McRae casts Pernicious Deed, and on my turn I attack LK for 2 with Varragoth, paying 2 mana when it attacks to search my library for a card and put it on top. Second main phase I play a Baron Moor, and at the end of turn McRae activates their Pernicious Deed for 4, destroying all non-land permanents with mana value 4 or less. This only leaves behind Bolas' Citadel, Yahenni, since LK sacrificed the copy of Lurrus, and token copies of Yawgmoth and Teshar. Then, since Yahenni survived, it also gets 5+1/+1 counters. On LK's turn, he pays 3 life to cast Athreos, God of Passage, which returns creatures to his hand when they die unless an opponent pays 3 life. Then, this also triggers Teshar, returning Lurrus from the graveyard to the battlefield. With Lurrus, he recasts Sol Ring from his graveyard, again triggering Teshar and returning Ellis from his graveyard to the battlefield. Then he plays a Swamp from the top of his library and casts Sheoldred Whispering One, making each opponent sacrifice a creature in their upkeep and allowing LK to return a creature from his graveyard to the battlefield in his upkeep. This also triggers Teshar, returning Morbid Opportunist from the graveyard to the battlefield. Then LK moves to combat, attacking McRae, Eddie, and I all for 2, since we unfortunately forgot to put the counters on Yahenni. Eddie casts Nylea's Bow and passes. McRae casts Muldrotha the Gravetide, letting them play a land and cast a permanent of each type from their graveyard each turn. This lets them play a Rogran Triome from their graveyard, then they pass. On my turn I cast Sol Ring, followed up by casting Puppeteer Click, putting LK's Lauren from his graveyard into play under my control, destroying the Bolas' Citadel when it enters. I immediately activate Lauren, letting Eddie and I both draw a card. Then, at the end of turn, LK sacrifices Ellis with Yahenni, putting a -1/-1 counter on Lauren, killing her while he draws 2 cards. Then, McRae pays 3 life to keep Ellis in the graveyard with Athreos. In LK's upkeep, Sheoldred triggers, returning Teshar from his graveyard to the battlefield. He then casts Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord, giving his creatures lifelink on his turn, casts Swiftfoot Boots, triggering both of his Teshars, returning Ellis and Lauren to the battlefield, gaining a life. He also then moves to combat, attacking McRae with his entire board, and McRae blocks Lurrus with Muldrotha, killing the cat but still taking 18 damage, while LK gains 21 total life. Then, McRae pays 3 more life to keep Lurrus in the graveyard. In his second main phase, he activates Sorin's +2 ability, doing 1 more damage to McRae, gaining a life. On Eddie's turn, he plays an island and casts Weirding Wood, enchanting his forest so it taps for 2 mana of any color, and also creates a clue token. Then he immediately sacrifices the clue to draw a card. In McRae's upkeep, they're forced to sacrifice Muldrotha because of Sheoldred, then they play a forest, cast an Aether Snipe, returning Sheoldred to LK's hand, and also cast Incandescent Soulstoke, giving their other elementals +1/+1, and letting them tap it to put an elemental from their hand into play, giving it haste and making them sacrifice it at the end of turn. On my turn, I cast Thwart the Grave, returning Varragoth, Bloodsky Sire from my graveyard to the battlefield, and then also returning Direfleet Ravager from my graveyard to the battlefield since it's a wizard. When the Ravager enters, it makes each player lose 1/3 of their life rounded up, and then I move to combat, attacking LK for 3 in the air with the Puppeteer. On LK's turn, he casts Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, letting any player draw a card and lose a life when they deal combat damage to one of his opponents with a creature. This gains him a life and triggers Teshar, returning Lurrus from the graveyard to the battlefield. Then LK equips Gix with Swiftfoot Boots, giving him haste and hexproof, letting him attack McRae for 4 in the air with both Teshars, knocking him out of the game, and also attack me for 17 with everything else. I block Gix and Morbid Opportunist, killing them and taking 13 total damage, while LK gains 21 life and pays 5 life to draw 5 cards, drawing a 6th card with the Morbid Opportunist. Then, in his second main phase, LK casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, making all non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast, gaining a life and returning Gix from the graveyard to the battlefield. Finally, he activates Sorin's -4 ability to return Yawgmoth from his graveyard to the battlefield. On Eddie's turn, he plays a Plains and casts Monk Idealist, returning an enchantment from his graveyard to his hand, in this case, Azusa's Many Journeys. He then activates the Bow of Nylea to gain 3 life, and passes. On my turn, I cast Coveted Prize, searching my library for a card and putting it into my hand. In response, LK sacrifices his own Thalia to Yawgmoth to draw 2 cards. Then, I move to combat, attacking LK with all of my creatures for 9, and in my second main phase, I cast Baleful Mastery for its student cost, exiling Sorin and letting Eddie draw a card. Unfortunately, this isn't enough to stop LK's board, as he's able to cast Junji the Midnight Sky on his turn, equipping it with the Swiftfoot Boots to give it haste and hexproof, allowing him to attack Eddie and I both for lethal damage, winning LK the game. Alright, so that was a pretty sweet game. Well, let's start off with our winner this week. So LK, absolutely amazing performance with Rada-Drobic. I'll be honest, it was kind of a pain in the butt going through and recording all of the different triggers that were happening because there was just so much going on. But it was super, super impressive to see and very cool to watch happen. Just the amount of recursion his deck had, the fact that we couldn't kill anything on his board because he just brought it back. Having things like multiple Teshars on board, or multiple LSL cores, or multiple Yawgmoths even, it was very sweet to see, and I think it just reinforces my fear of Rada-Drobic, knowing that whenever Rada-Drobic is around, it can do some super, super messed up stuff. So, very, very cool win by LK, very well deserved as well. He kind of fought off all 3 opponents the entire game. Next up, we had Eddie, who unfortunately didn't get to do too much. He missed a few land drops, couldn't really find any enchantments, especially when he had Tuvasa on board. I think that he could have done quite a bit more had he been allowed to keep Arasta, because I'm sure there would have been instants and sorceries cast. I know I cast quite a few, so he probably could have tried to defend against whatever LK was doing, but losing Arasta really started to hurt. And unfortunately, that is something that kind of hindered Eddie throughout the course of the game. Next up, taking a look at McRae's deck, their elemental deck also seemed very, very cool. We got to see stuff like Muldrotha and the Soulstoke, and there was some very sweet cards that unfortunately, again, didn't quite get the chance to shine because of things like Sheoldred kind of being in play, or necessary board wipes that needed to happen, or just blocking. So not the best showing by the elementals, but still very, very cool, and I would love to see that deck again because I think there's some sweet synergies that can come from it. And then finally, of course, we got to talk about our deck. I also kind of got stuck on lands. We only had 2 for the longest time, and honestly, if it wasn't for LK letting us draw with Lauren, we might have been stuck for even longer. With that being said, though, I do still think our deck did a very good job of showing off what it's capable of. We still were able to get multiple creatures into play. We did some reanimation. We tutored our deck for several cards and tried to find the best outs to each situation. So I think that if we had actually had the lands, we could have done a much better job of controlling the board. That would have also allowed us to search out something like a board wipe to kind of deal with what was happening. So I don't say this a lot for our decks, but I think that if I had to pick a deck to give a second chance at some point in the future, it would definitely be Purraj, because it felt so close to doing what it really wanted to do and so close to being super powerful. It just didn't quite get the chance to showcase it. So if I ever get the chance to give it a second chance, I think this is probably the deck I would pick. And that might be a bit of recency bias, but it's such a cool deck. I'm genuinely really proud of this one, and I think that the party mechanic is a little bit underutilized, especially in Commander, because there's just so many sweet party creatures. But that's enough rambling about the deck. Overall, thank you all so much for watching, getting us to 101 episodes. If you did like the video, please do actually like the video, subscribe to the channel. I know that a lot of people who find our videos are not subscribed. I would love it if you could. We're trying to hit that 500 mark, but if you have any suggestions for future cards, please do leave those in the comments below. Send them to me on Twitter, Reddit, email. Any of that is perfectly fine. But with all of that being said, hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.